All right. So my name is Matt, and I'll be talking about one of my latest passion, which is testing, and testing Ext JS and Sencha Touch, more specifically. So I was at a very nice conference a few weeks back, which was Source DevCon in London, where I did this talk that I'm about to give now. So I'm just going to run through the slides real quick, and then we'll actually look at how you actually use Siesta for testing Ext and Sencha Touch. So what I'm going to run through today is basically why you should test your JavaScript, if that's needed to explain at all. We'll look at some testing methodologies. I'll introduce Siesta and talk about the pros and cons of using a testing tool. Writing testable JavaScript is also a very important topic. It might not be obvious to everyone how to structure your code to make sure it's very easy to test. And we'll also try to cover automation at the end. So briefly about me, I'm based in the southern part of Sweden. I run a company called Bryntum. We basically do two types of components. One is a scheduling component. One other one is a Gantt component, more for project management and so on. And a while back, we also created a JavaScript testing tool called Siesta. So that's basically our story. So this obviously doesn't work too well in an online meetup. So I'll just skip through this, kind of getting a feel of how many of you are doing front-end testing and so on. So we'll skip that.
We can put that in.
All right.
I'll get a little poll here.
Yeah. Let's get a poll. See if we can just see if we get responses.
So how many of you have a front end?
So
let's do yes, no for that. So actually make it. Do you have a front end test suite? There we go. So you can all go ahead and vote on that.
Cool. I'll stop my webcam too. All right. So here we go. Hope that's coming through. Right. So let's see, where were we? Right. So that's the poll. It's posted. So why should you test your JavaScript at all? So if you look at a typical web application these days, it's typically sitting on a server in some server room somewhere, and it's connecting to the internet to various consuming devices. It could be iOS devices, laptops, or desktop computers. We don't really know when we write our application how it's going to be consumed. So on the back end, we typically have a single control platform. It might be PHP, C#, Java, whatever you want, basically. It's simple to test and refactor since we have really good tools. The languages have been around for a while and lots of best practices and so on. And then we jump to the front end. We'll see that the story is somewhat different. We now have different platforms. We have Mac, Windows, XP, Vista, 7, 8. We have Linux. We have so many different platforms. For each platform, we have different versions. We also have different browser versions. We also have different doc types and simulation modes for certain browsers. So the level of insecurity and the things that are unknown are so much more, that there's just so much more of that on the front end. It's also quite hard to refactor since JavaScript is a dynamically typed language, and the tools are not really there if you compare to the server side. And to sum up, it's just too easy to fail as a front-end developer. You can just touch one little comma in a CSS file and your entire layout breaks apart, and you have really no way of knowing without actually opening a web page to see that. So having some type of tool to help you detect errors really early helps you fail as little as possible. But then we might get some resistance. Some developers may not see the need for testing, and some managers will typically say that this takes away time from creating these awesome features that the customer wants, which of course will then mean that you also get time for adding new bugs, since it's very rare that code is perfect and bug-free all the time. Some will say that it's QA's job to test. That might be right. It depends on how you look at things. And yeah, some will just say, no, I'm not going to do testing. I'll just quit. But when you look at it, testing is actually a really good investment. So writing tests should be considered a serious investment in your code. It will take time, that's for sure. It's not going to be something that you do in 5 minutes, an hour, or even a day or a week. It's going to take time, but in the end, it will pay you back, and most likely not instantly. It might be a couple of months or 6 months before you see the rewarding results of this, but I can just say that the results are fantastic when you have a well-covering test suite. So let's say we have a scenario, a bug was found. So first reaction, we can always panic and run out of the office. That's option one. We can also be in a rush and do a hot fix, a monkey patch, just get it fixed so that the customer is happy, or whatever the use case might be. Or we can sit down and try to prevent this fix or make this fix prevent the bug from coming back ever. So cover it with a test case and so on. So those are kind of the three ways we can look at things. And so when you get your test suite, you basically get a whole new level of confidence in your code. So the test suite actually also gives you extra level of documentation for free, and it allows you to refactor a whole lot easier. And as I just said, bugs happen once. If you wrap every bug you find with a test case, they won't come back unnoticed, which is a real big relief. Also for your customers to make sure if they report a bug to you, that's going to be the last they see of it. It's not coming back past your test suite again. And all of this sums up to quality of sleep, which is something I can speak for myself, since after we started using Siesta for our scheduling tools, the life has become a lot more pleasant, because I can now sleep resting assured that my code is not guaranteed to run, but it's highly likely that it will function if I randomly open an example I have. So basically the whole background of us writing Siesta in the first place was that we started writing the scheduler and GAN components on Ext JS 3, and then it was time to upgrade to Ext JS 4. And since our components are based on the grid panel and tree panel, which were, both of those were significantly rewritten in Ext 4, so we had to almost start from scratch. And that was kind of scary, because the components are quite large, so how do we actually know that we have ported every bit of functionality from the old Ext JS 3 platform to the new platform? So how do we know when we're done? So we had really no way of feeling ready. We had our examples, but the examples didn't cover all of the functionality, hardly. So Siesta came out of a very real need based on our own reality. So let's talk about one more thing, which is very important. It's when you do code handover. Test cases are really useful when handing over code responsibility for a JavaScript module. So let's say you have a developer, Bob, he quits his job. New guy gets the responsibility of his code. How will this new guy know which part of the code base is safe to change and how to refactor? So new guy obviously opens the code base and looks around and maybe finds some comments like this. This is just random stuff I found on some blog collecting awesome code comments. So of course this will mean that the guy is freaking out, because now he has absolutely no confidence in going into the code and feeling at home. So if there's no tests to sort of keep things from breaking, this guy will never have the guts to touch any parts of the code, which will lead to only slight changes, like on the surface of the application, minor cosmetic stuff, and over time these types of systems typically generate a lot of craft, and this I've seen this a lot of times before, and I'm sure it sounds familiar to you too. So briefly about testing methodologies, I'm going to mention just three. There's unit testing, there's integration testing, and also functional testing. So unit testing is basically testing the API of a single isolated unit. And typically when you talk about unit testing JavaScript, you don't mean DOM, you mean non-UI, data stuff, logic stuff, business logic stuff. For example, verifying the set and get methods of a model, or verify date manipulation logic. Those are great examples of code that is really easy to test. And for this job, you have a lot of tools available. So we have Siesta does this, of course. There's Jasmine. There's QUnit for the jQuery camp. Google released something called Google JS Test a while back. And the list goes on and on. Then there's integration testing, which is making sure that Unit A can be integrated with Unit B, and they can interact and communicate or whatever they're supposed to do together. So one example would be like verifying that the cell editing plugin can be actually plugged into the grid panel. And then, of course, there's the more higher level functional web testing, which is UI testing of a component or an application as a whole. Typically, we send commands to the web page and evaluate the results of these actions. So we'll say, click this button, type into this login field, hit the login button, verify that a cookie was returned by the server with the valid user ID or something like that, or valid session ID. So that's typically what functional web testing is about. And again, there's lots of tools. I'll just mention a few. Selenium is probably the one most of you have heard about before, which is sort of almost the industry standard. It has a huge community, open source. So there's also JS Test Driver, which was written by a guy who works at Google. And then, of course, there's Siesta. So Siesta is basically a mix of unit testing, and it also handles functional testing. So when you want to interact with a DOM, you basically have two approaches if you're doing a test tool. So you can either use synthetic events or native events. So this is sort of a little bit off topic, but just to give you an idea of what Siesta is actually doing. So synthetic events are actually just JavaScript objects. They're generated in pure JavaScript. They're supported by all major browsers. They're compatible with mobile devices, and they don't rely on the native event queue, which means you can run events in parallel, which is good for test execution speed, of course. The downside of synthetic events is that browsers don't fully trust the events and the default actions of these events. So, for example, if you simulate the enter key on a focused link, it doesn't do the same thing as if you would click or if you would hit the enter key manually on your keyboard. Same thing for tabbing between input fields. The tab doesn't jump to the next field as you would expect. So it's definitely possible to work around this, and we actually do this manually, but there are some things that we have to be aware of. And then there's plenty of cross-browser differences when it comes to these DOM events. There's different key events, different key codes. And if you want to go deep into this subject, there's an interesting site called unixpapa.com, which covers it all. Native events are done through Java applets, which are supported in desktop browsers only. And this is basically as close as you get to a real user as is ever possible. The downside, and I guess this is a quite big downside, but this won't work on iOS or Android, and tests cannot be parallelized since the native event queue is used. So enter Siesta. Siesta is basically a unit testing and DOM testing tool, highly optimized for Ext JS and Sencha Touch. But it can also test any JavaScript, raw JavaScript, jQuery, Node.js, or anything you can think of, since it's all web-based. It has a very simple syntax, as we'll see in a bit. It's extensible. It can be automated using great tools such as Phantom.js and Selenium Remote Control. So the Siesta tool has a browser harness, which I'll show you shortly, which is basically a UI for the Siesta tool that you can use to debug your tests. You can inspect the DOM, you can check elements, use Firebug or whatever tools you use. You can investigate why assertions are failing and so on. It also shows you a tree of your tests defined in logical groups, as I'm sure you're used to in other tools. And it also has a bunch of global settings like auto check globals, which tells Siesta to inspect the global namespace after each test to see if there's been any leaks or global variables that are unexpected. You can also instruct Siesta to preload a certain number of files. So if you're testing Ext JS, it would of course make sense to preload Ext JS, all debug in each test and so on. And you can also plug in your own test class, which comes back to the extensibility. So if there's some feature or thing that you want to test in your application, some aspect of Ext JS that we don't cover yet, you can just augment Siesta yourself easily and plug in a test class to the harness. And basically, a Siesta test is just pure JavaScript. It's no magic. There's nothing to install. There's no new language to learn. It basically just looks like this. You can think of start test as your ext on ready hook. So start test is called when the test starts. So it sounds obvious, of course. It takes a function as the only parameter, or it actually can take extra configuration options for this particular test, but we won't go into that right now. So the T variable here, which you can name whatever you want, is the test instance itself, which is where you find all the assertion method and so on. So the simplest, most possible jQuery test would look like this. I think this is actually part of our examples as well in the Siesta SDK. So we take the body, we dump some HTML, and then we do a t.content-like, which is basically looking at some element and looking for this string. And this is the third line is the assertion description. So this is probably the simplest test we can think of. And a Siesta test is also completely isolated in its own iframe. This means that you don't have to do any teardown or cleanup or setup before your tests. Every test will start fresh, so that makes it very easy to maintain your tests and so on. And like I said, you can extend the Siesta environment with your own custom assertions and helper methods. So maybe you're testing some application login scenario, or maybe a login has to be performed before you start your test. So then you might add a method called perform login to your test class, and then another assertion method called is logged in, which sends in some hypothetical app object and then outputs this. and so on. So if there's something you need, or if there's some type of procedure that you do a lot in your testing, you can break it out and reuse it over and over in all of your tests, which is very handy. And then let's take a quick look at the life cycle of a UI test. It typically follows 4 different patterns. So the things you do in testing the UI is always some type of setup. You create some grid or you load some store. You basically set the environment that you're about to test. And then with web applications, as I'm sure you know, there's a lot of waiting involved since there's so many async behaviors. So there's a lot of waiting involved, and there's plenty of wait support in Siesta as well. Like wait for store to load, or wait for grid to render, wait for X type, wait for component query. All of these things, because there's just so many things that are asynchronous in the web world. We also have simulations, of course, so you can instruct Siesta to click somewhere, click a button, click a component, click any element, click a position, X, Y coordinates, type into a checkbox, into a text box, and so on. And then, of course, the final one is the assertion step, where we verify that A is actually equal to B as we expect it to be. So the setup will look very familiar. This is just where you create or set up the environment. Maybe you create a user grid that you're supposed to interact with and render it to the body. This is pure, simple Ext code. The waiting part is, of course, to wait. And if you want to click a row, you have to wait for it to exist first. So we have a method called wait for rows visible, which you pass it a grid, and you get a callback. And here you can do whatever you want. We also have component queries support. So we can actually wait for any component query. Maybe you have a form panel with a text field in it. We want to wait until the text field is actually available and can be found in the component manager. And we also invented our own type of query, which is a composite query, which is a combination of component query and CSS selector. So this also gives you very expressive power to sort of get the grid, which is a component query. This is the X type that we're querying for. When the grid is found, we'll also wait for this to be fulfilled. So this actually evaluates to sort of the same thing as wait for rows visible. But this is completely generic and can be used to find any type of element based on a CSS selector inside of a component, which is actually quite useful, we've found. So this is the magic separator that you have to use. And the simulation part is also very important. Here we typically specify actions like this in a chain, which is executed step by step. So we specify action, we can specify click, and then we send it a target. So here we can specify either a coordinate, we can pass in a real DOM element, an Ext JS element, we can pass in a real component instance, we can pass in a component query, like in this case, or we can pass in a CSS selector. So you have lots of things to choose from, and you don't have to use just elements or CSS selectors, but typically you want to stay on a very high abstraction level. You want to work with components. So this is a good way to grab your grid, and grab inside of the grid, you grab its trigger field. So this is clicking the trigger field. This is actually from one of the Siesta tests. And typing is similar. Action equals type, target, the same trigger field, and text equals foo. So you in these UI tests, you end up with a chain of the simulation of a user. And the final one is, of course, verify, where we run all the checkers like t.is, user store get count, 5 users found. We have an observable helper test class, which has methods like will, fire, and times. You pass in something that is observable and the number of times that you expect this event to happen, right? So This makes sure that during the duration of the test, store fires 2 write events. And then on the element helper class, we have a method called hasCLS, which just checks the class name of the DOM element for my class in this case. And on the component helper layer, we have hasSize, which checks window and makes sure that it has the right size. So it's quite straightforward. And there's also an API, of course, which is very much like Sencha's. Let's see if we can find it. So you can actually just go there and find all these methods that you can use very easily, like this. So here you'll find all the stuff I mentioned, like hasCLS, has as if the element has the supplied CSS class name, and so on. Right. So let's actually wait with the demo for now, and let's just power through the last slides, and then we'll go into the testing part. So Siesta also has a Sencha Touch harness and full support for testing Sencha Touch. So you can tap, double tap, swipe, long press, so on. So I'll show you that too in a bit. And looking forward, we're going to add support for benchmarking, code coverage. Hopefully, we'll also launch a cloud service allowing you to do multi-browser, multi-device testing. We also have a tool called Code Cowboy. That's the nickname we have so far, which is basically going to be a crowdsourced test case tool. More about that at a future point. And if you have any suggestions for what you think Siesta should do, just let me know. We're very interested to get feedback. Finally, I'll just briefly mention that you can also use Siesta together with Phantom JS and Selenium to run your tests outside of the browser and use a headless version, which is really nice for speed, because you can also automate this and make it part of your continuous integration process, which is a big win, I think. So that's a big thing. So if you haven't heard about Phantom JS, it's actually made by one of the guys at Sencha called Arya Hidayat, and it's a superb tool. I definitely recommend you check it out. It's a headless WebKit engine, and it does all kinds of cool things like PDF or PNG output as well. So yeah, I'll skip these for now. Writing testable JavaScript, I'll just mention some things that we should think about. Of course, keep your JavaScript in JavaScript files. That's sort of obvious. Don't put JavaScript in your HTML. We don't do that anymore. Of course, this is bad. So testing MVC code. Here, I think we can actually make a big difference by deciding to use a fat model or a fat store and a skinny view. So you don't want to have any business logic lying around in your views, because once they're in your view, they're by definition hard to test because you have to involve the DOM. That's no good. So testing pure JavaScript is always easier, and of course it promotes reuse of your code. If your business logic is stuck in some grid panel, you could not reuse it for a form later. So putting it in the store definitely makes sense. So quick example, if you have a user form, you might be tempted to put an isValid function right on the form because you can, but instead you can just decorate the user model with this method and reuse this in every part of your application that uses this user model class. And then the refactored view, of course, just asks the model for the result. So it's quite basic stuff, but it actually makes a big difference when it comes to testability. Also avoid private code. If you cannot access your code, it will be hard to test, of course. Testing Ajax, we'll skip that for now. Automation I'll show you in a bit, so we'll skip these slides. CI tools, it's old. Let's see this. So for further resources, if you're interested in generic JavaScript testing, there's a lot of really good stuff on the video center of Yahoo called screen.yahoo.com. If you just search for JavaScript testing, you will find a lot of stuff. good stuff as well. They have really smart people. Similarly, in YouTube, if you Google, if you search YouTube for GTAC, which is short for Google Test Automation Conference, you'll see the latest and greatest that Google does in their annual conference every year. So they have so many things, and they're really cutting-edge presentations there. So I highly recommend that too. And before we go into the actual demonstration, I'll leave you with my favorite quote. If you're not doing unit testing, you cannot be refactoring. You're just changing shit. That's something I read on Twitter, which is seriously wise words, I think. So that's sort of the end of the slides. Let's start to look at the actual Siesta tool itself. Let's just get a cup of water. Are you following along? Is it making sense? I hope it does. Right. So let's start here. This is what the Siesta harness looks like. You double click to run a test. You get some output here, seeing what happened, what passed, what failed. You also have the option to mark something as a to-do. So maybe you find a bug, but you don't have the time to fix it right now, but you might as well write the test case for it while it's fresh in memory and you know what triggers the bug. You can wrap it in a to-do, and then it gets highlighted like this. Once you fix the bug, you should, of course, remove the wrapping to-do, because then it should just be a normal test. So this is what it looks like when you have simple assertions. You can scroll down here and see what's going on, why tests are failing and so on. So all these are to-do, looking like this. If these were not wrapped in to-do, they would be red. So you can also inspect the source right in the browser. So here you can see what's happening. We're highlighting some of these failed rows. So t.ok checks for something truthy. Not OK checks for something falsy, like false, 0, undefined. We have is for comparison. We have isn't for not equal, of course. Like for string matching. We have throws OK for functions that should throw an exception. Lives OK for the opposite. We have is deeply for object comparisons. We also have deeply strict for triple equality checks and so on. Siesta will also check for global variables at the end of each test, which is really good because it's so easy to slip and insert global variables without thinking about it. We have wait for support, like this. So you can wait for basically for any condition. If you don't find the correct wait for, you can just wait for whatever you want. So here we're waiting for a CSS selector. And we're adding this CSS class after 3 seconds, and we're waiting for mouse move. We're waiting for event mouse move fired on the document. So you have a lot of support for waiting, which you'll see. You really need a lot of wait support. And if you don't believe me, you open the Ext JS all debug and search for set timeout or defer. So the nature of the web is delayed, so to speak. So these are typically the data sort of tests with the simple stuff, and then we have the UI side of things where we can actually create and interact with the components, more advanced components that calls remote stores and verifies that the loading of the store has gone okay. So on. We can resize windows easily if we want. This is still loading. Yep, we can switch this to not use speedrun so that you have easier time to see what's happening. So here's a slow drag drop test. You can type into forms like this. And as we type, after we're done, we can validate that the form is containing the things we want, and so on. We can click checkboxes. And so on. So plenty of support for interacting with the page any way a user would do it. So and also one thing that I should mention is that we rely very heavily on this now for ourselves for testing Ext scheduler and so on. So I'll just open our test suite. So this is our development environment. I hope this is still visible for you. So here's our complete test suite, and we have tests for most of the things in that the component can do. So for example, we have a component that is supposed to, we have a plugin that allows the user to edit each event metadata, and it looks something like this. So here we're actually making sure that we can create new events and edit them and so on. I can play that one more time. So first we double click, we type something into the event, we save, we make sure that the underlying record was updated, we delete the event, and then we create a new one and make sure that it's inserted into the store and rendered okay. So that the text we typed into this should be the same that we typed here, right? So quite complex test, one of the more complex we have, but still, it's not really that long. It's less than 100 lines. So you'll see the things I talked about, wait for events to render. That sounds quite obvious. We're double clicking some CSS class that I added to one of the events. We're verifying that the editor shows up. We reset the title field. Then we type into the title field test 1, 2, 3, like here, and then we click the save button, which is just this is a real Ext component, of course. So target can be a string for a component query, or a DOM element, or an Ext element, or an Ext component, or an array of coordinates. So you have plenty of options to interact with the DOM. And then we, of course, verify that the store was updated okay, the record got its value okay, and so on. So it's quite straightforward. It's not that tricky. So this is what it looks like, and we use this very, very heavily. So let's actually also look at how a harness looks. So we looked at how the test looks. So to configure the harness, which drives the UI in this case, we basically do a harness configure with we can set a title, and we can set things like let's say this is probably not the best example. Let's switch to this one. So you can define like auto check globals, which tells Siesta to check the globals before closing each test. Keep results if you want the results to stay the iframes to stay in the page and to not be cleaned up. And if you expect globals, of course you will expect Ext, since you're testing Ext, and maybe you have some of your own. You also tell Siesta what to preload for each test. So if you're testing Sencha Touch applications, you would of course include Sencha Touch and your application files. And then you tell the harness to start and pass it basically the structure of your tree. So this is what becomes the UI, the input for the UI. So we have a group called Sanity, which does some low-level sanity checks. We have some functional tests that I'll show you in a bit. So a harness is very easy to configure. And of course, it can all be found here in the docs, the things that you can configure. So it's all listed here. Yeah, you can break on fail if you wanted to break on the first failure it finds. You can just set it here, auto check globals and so on. So let's look at this particular suite that I opened here. This is actually a suggestion by Niels Dell, who wrote this really nice path-like menu. I don't know if you've seen this, but it's a really nice Sencha Touch widget. I hope that's visible. So he said to me that it would be cool if we could test this widget. So I said, yeah, sure, let's do it. So I spent some time today and wrote some tests for it, just some small ones. So this is how our Siesta Touch UI looks like. It's more scaled down, and this is aimed to be run in Chrome or in iPad or iPhone or Android or so on. So the simplest test that we can do is a sanity test, which I'll show you. I'll just run it. Doesn't do anything visual. We can go to the assertions list, and it just makes sure that some of the classes are here, and at the end it makes sure that there's no global variables. So we can just look at this test real quickly. Sanity. So this is what it's doing. It's not really doing anything. It's just verifying that these three symbols exist. So just to make sure that your code is not completely broken. And then I also did another thing. I created a lint test which runs JS hint, and there I actually found a failure in the code. So we can go here and we can see, okay, so this class is okay, no lint errors. And here I see that in the menu class there's a lint error. So this is a very cheap way of making sure that the code you release actually has a high level of quality. So now we can actually we could clean it up right now, but we'll just wait for one more thing. I'll show you what that is. We'll run the UI test as well. I'll show you the globals detection. So it actually opened the menu and clicked it, and you see there's 6 passing assertions, and there's 1 failure, which is the unexpected global found, which is angle. And this, to me, sounds like a leak. So let's see if we can actually detect this if we search for angle. What do we have? So this looks like an interesting one. So let's see. Everything's still following. So let's see. Here's something that looks odd. So this line is clearly missing a comma here, which turns this into a new line. So this will be a semicolon insertion, and here we have a global, an implicit global, so to speak. So what if we add this and rerun the test? So now we actually fixed a bug in this, and I can push this and do a pull request to Nils. So no unexpected global variables found, and this is actually the same bug that was detected in the lint test. So now we can rerun the lint test, and everything is fine. So the lint test is basically just doing 3 requests, because this is a very small and easy to test widget. So we load each class, do a request. In the callback, we just do the validate, which does a JS hint evaluation, and iterates the results, if there's anything found, of course. So that's how you would use Siesta to test Sencha Touch. It's very simple. There's also the same thing that you would expect, like tapping and long press and swipe and so on, but I won't go into those details yet. So we'll leave that for now. I'll also mention briefly, before we take questions, that we, of course, use Siesta to test Siesta. So let's see if we can find this. Close this and open this one. So just to show you how we use Siesta, I recently added a feature which was supposed to allow you to double-click a line in the assertion grid if it failed, and take you to the take you to the failed code line automatically. So I decided that would be a nice feature to actually test in the Siesta UI. So let's see, okay, that's the wrong one. So if we run this one, so here we can see we're running Siesta inside of Siesta, and I have a fake failing assertion. So you can see here, if I go here, double click, I'm taken to the highlighted line, which says t.fail foo, which is failing, not very surprisingly. But this is a quite nice way to show that Siesta is completely isolated, and I can run as many copies of Siesta inside of Siesta as I want, because everything's framed, so nothing will leak out or become scary. You can be completely safe that your environment is sandboxed. So I hope this is shown up on your screen. But this is, yeah, simple way of testing Siesta inside of Siesta. So final thing before we close for today will be to show you the automation part, which is sort of the thing that makes Siesta useful, because testing in the browser is really good, but it's still time consuming. So what you want to have is the automation part. So let's look at one of the scheduler tests, which I have here. Let's see, let's take some other one. Take this one. So in the scheduler, there's an API for switching between year view or month view or day view or so on. And when this is done, there's supposed to be a before view change event and a view change event. So we use the will fire end times to verify this, that both of these are fired. So, and we also, in this test, verify that the arguments are passed correctly. So I want to see that the scheduler panel is the first argument. I want to see the name of the preset as the second argument. I also want to see the new proposed start date and end date as the third and fourth. So if I change this to something else and run this, you'll see that it breaks. So here I'm actually running Phantom JS inside of my IDE, which is Visual Studio. And this will work in any IDE since this is just using the command line. And I've mapped it to my favorite key command, so I can do it really, really fast. So now I can, of course, fix the test and run it again. And all tests passed, of course. And if I expect no before view change events, then it will say 0 before view change events were expected, but 1 were fired. And so this actually makes it easy to verify the contract of some type of observable component. So this is very easy to run on the command line without having to open the browser, because now I can get almost like a 1 second response, or just instant feedback almost to any test I run. So I can go back and run the advanced event editor tests on the command line too. It takes a bit longer because it's actually moving the mouse and so on, simulating a lot of things, but it will run and it will pass in this case. So this is, of course, a lot faster than having to open the browser, double-click, sit and wait, so on. So using the command line is really the key to making things fast and doing nice continuous integration stuff. Right, so I think that's about it for my demonstration. I'd be happy to take some questions, or if there's any parts of the Siesta offering that you would like to see demoed, I'd be happy to do more demos too. It's, the word is free. I should also mention, by the way, that Siesta comes in 2 flavors. The default one is free, which allows you to run everything in the browser and so on. It has all the functionality. Just go to bryntum.com/products/siesta, download button right there. The only thing missing is the automation support. So if you want to be able to run on Phantom or Selenium or so on, you need to buy a license. But you can use all the features that I've demonstrated except for the automation. So it's very easy to get started and start playing around and see if this works. But I think it should be very useful. Is there any scenarios that you had a hard time testing in the past, or something that I completely missed? Any type of questions, just fire away.
So you can type your questions into the chat.
Also mentioned we have a forums. So to add new support, you mean to like add support for testing some scenario that's not covered by Siesta out of the box? So I'll show you something related to that, because we have a lot of things that are repeating in all of our scheduler tests. So we have a scheduler test class which has a lot of extra goodies that are really useful for us, like convenience methods for get first event L, get first schedule cell L, get resource store. So we don't have to have stuff like this in each and every test. So we have just refactored and made all this sort of object-oriented and broken it out into helper methods. So we have get event store, get scheduler is of course what's used the most. So if you open a random test, you'll see a lot of these. Get scheduler, which is not part of the Siesta offering by default, but since we use a test class called Bryntum.test and we plug it into the harness, test class Bryntum.test, we can add anything we want in there. So we can wait for a good one that is very useful. Wait for events to render is used in almost all our tests, since we have to interact.
Matt, I'm not sure you're aware of this, but your screen sharing is off, so you got to go and turn that back on again.
That sucks. Yeah. Sorry. Yes. So basically, I was saying that the test class that we have, like, it's just defined like this: Bryntum.test. You plug it into the harness like this: test class equals Bryntum.test, and in here you'll find this method getScheduler, which is used in almost all of our tests. You can see it like this: getScheduler, and we'll just pass in the config that is that's relevant to this actual test. So, is that coming up, Steve?
Yep, looks good.
All right, cool. So that's it. Yeah, wait for events to render. It's also a very useful one, which is very scheduler specific and will never be part of Siesta since it's just for us. But this is how you would do it to add your own custom stuff. Anyone else have any questions or thoughts? Steve, anything?
Nothing from my end. Looks like we've got a couple more folks who are just putting in some comments, so we'll give them another moment or two before we shut things down for the evening.
Cool.
I do want to thank you for taking time out to present. It was an awesome presentation, particularly since what time is it there now? On you're in Europe, right? So it's what about 1 a.m. 1:30 a.m.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's no problem.
Ouch.
No problem. It's no problem.
So,
I'll sleep in tomorrow, so it'll be okay.
You know, it's, as we all know as developers, sleep is for the weak. So.
Exactly. That sounds about right.
Okay. All right. So let's do it. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the meeting recording here. And